to welcome everybody back to this second half of our day on Iranian and Western philosophy and peace. We're discussing how we can help, as mere academics and thinkers, the rapprochement or peacemaking in the Middle East, particularly as far as Iran and Western and American and Israeli and UK relations are going, which are very fractious. How we can draw back from any kind of future conflict or war is completely ridiculous. Now, we're meeting on the 15th of September here in the Castle of the Muses in Scotland at a time when the Middle East is erupting in furore about a film that was made about Prophet Muhammad, and it's caused a lot of unrest in the Middle East and conflict. So I want to read a statement about that and just give colleagues a bit of background, because we haven't had time to research this. And then we can move on into our second half, because it is relevant, really. And this is a statement from a scholar who's a Sunni Muslim, who's actually from South Africa, and who's done many years of research in Islamic studies and Islamic law and philosophy. And he was here in the Castle of the Muses only a few weeks ago. And he's working with our Institute of Peace Studies to develop peace studies courses in the Middle East. So I think it's very important that we hear his voice at this time. And he's a sheikh who's currently resident in Dublin and has a mosque in Dublin, Sheikh Satardian. Salam to my brothers and sisters. Peace to my non-Muslim acquaintances, colleagues, friends, and my Muslim brothers and sisters. We are sad souls, but we are not mad souls. In the light of the present furore all over the world, the questions that come to mind again is this: do we react as Muslims with anger and violence, or dialogue and education? The saga of violence seems to occur once again, as in the case of Salman Rushdie's attack on the Prophet of Islam. At that time, I chose to write, produce and direct a play called Islam versus the Satanic Verses, to counter the lies and accusations, and it ran to a full week in an auditorium in Ireland. When the cartoons are drawn to disparage, denigrate and defame the Prophet Muhammad, I established a new academic discipline as Professor of World Cultures called Muhammadology, which is the study of the Prophet's life and the effects of the prophetic mission. When I debated Robert Spencer, Sam Harris et al., who were self-confessed sworn arch-enemies of Islam and the Prophet Muhammad, they could not reply in an academic manner with empirical evidence, but to base their arguments on lies and differences. But I continue to debate them. When Geert Wilder's film was made, Fitna, to attack Islam, we responded with ongoing seminars and discussions that informed and educated people about authentic Islam and the authentic mission of Muhammad. So my first call to Muslims at this time is not to be angry, but to be wise. If we are accused of being violent, then why do we respond with violence? If the American administration is not behind the production of the movie, then why are the protests directed against the American administration and embassies? When the head of the Catholic Church, Pope Benedict, accused the Prophet of bringing none other than violence, we could challenge him academically and have dialogue workshops, which do seem to have exceeded indeed. So why not get that way again in the case of this film, Innocence of Muslims? I'm organising an Islamic competition to draw something to express our love for the Prophet Muhammad and what you personally have learnt and benefited from his mission. How did his life and teachings affect you personally? How well did we master Islam? Nevertheless, the attack on the American consulate in Benghazi, Libya, and the killing of the American ambassador and embassy staff must be totally and vehemently condemned. And the protests all over the world have to be peaceful. Although America is perceived to be arrogant, dismissive, derisive and divisive, and needs to concentrate on more genuine respect, dialogue, development and diplomacy with the 1.8 billion Muslims of the world, There is no justification whatsoever for such violent and incomprehensible behaviour against American diplomats. Everyone is honoured by God, and life must be respected. Although the 14 minutes YouTube trailer of the alleged film Innocence of Muslims is indeed 14 minutes of incompetence, poor acting, directing, script and cinematography, it is totally reprehensible, insensitive and a deliberate attack on the character of a man that is held dear in the hearts of every single Muslim. The ineptitude of the film is directed towards grossly insulting Muhammad and thereby unexpectedly raising the ire of every devout Muslim. And indeed, it is a calculated attack of mischief to inflame the Muslims of the world. The question that immediately arises is who exactly is behind this unnecessary and unjustifiable attack on the Prophet of Islam. It's an individual calling himself Sam Basile who claimed responsibility. He said he was a Jew from Israel and that the film was funded by other Jews. However, it turns out this is totally untrue. Sam Basile does not even exist. In fact, Basile is Nakula Basili Nakula. Sam Basile turns out to be a Coptic Christian, and most of his supporters are evangelical Christians. Basili has a history of using false names in his enterprises, including Mark Basili, Yusuf Basili, PJ Tobacco, Nicola Basili, Erwin Salome, and many others. In 2010, he was convicted of bank fraud in the USA and was fined $790,000 and served 21 months in jail. In 1997, Basili was charged with intent to manufacture methamphetamine, a highly addictive illegal drug. Pleading guilty, he served a year in jail with another 3 years on probation. However, after violating his probation in 2002, he was sent to jail again for another year. So this is the calibre of the man behind the assault on the reputation of our Prophet. Not content with attempting to dupe the audience for his film, Basili also duped the actors and production crew. He allegedly told the actors and crew that the film was about Egypt 2,000 years ago, and never mentioned Islam or the Prophet Muhammad. Apparently, it is claimed that after the actors and crew departed the film, Basili dubbed in the references to Islam and the Prophet. In fact, the crew has just released a statement which says, quotes, "We are shocked by the drastic rewrites of the script and lies that were told to all involved. We are deeply saddened by the tragedies that have occurred." End of quotes. The content of the trailer on YouTube, it purports to show that the Prophet Muhammad was a very bad and stupid and gluttonous man. We, however, know the manifestations of the Prophet and witness to the great character which is in the Holy Quran and the Hadith and the authentic sayings attributed to him. The Arabian Peninsula was very different approximately 1500 years ago. The ability to read and write was not very common and minimal, so very few writings exist from that period. Any history that exists tells us that prior to the arrival of the Prophet, the region was unjust, savage, ravaged with infanticide, internecine wars, full of bandits and lacking any civilizing influences. We know with absolute certainty that the Arabian Peninsula changed for the better after the advent and enlightening mission of the Prophet Muhammad. We know that life became more civilized, people became more God-conscious, spiritual, and that the savage tribes became more civilized. There was a renaissance in the region that spread to every corner of the world. This is not in dispute by anybody, even the detractors. So how likely is it that a bad, stupid man could achieve all this? How likely is it that God chose a bad man to deliver his message to the world? Basili's attempt to demonize the Prophet Muhammad follows the well-worn path of taking elements of a person's life and distorting them to mean something quite different from the reality. He took a very small slice of truth and twisted it with venomous prejudice and malice to make it look very flawed. This is a common tactic known as black propaganda. For example, we know the Prophet was an orphan. Basili, in his warped mind, tried to portray him as a, quotes, bastard, unquote. We know that the Prophet had several wives. Basili portrays him as, quotes, sex crazy, and exaggerated the numbers. In black propaganda context, in black propaganda, the context is entirely omitted. 1500 years ago, women were treated as little more than luggage. Without a husband, most would have starved or been attacked. So it was the custom in the region, and indeed across the then known world, for widowed women, single women, and orphaned girls to be co-opted into families to ensure their safety, security, and survival and basic human rights. Of course, for people with destructive intents, like Sam Basile and his accomplices, the above can be twisted to mean virtually anything. But a person's true nature can be seen from the products of their lives. What has a person done in life? What has been the outcome of their actions? It is from these things that one can determine whether or not a person is good or bad. We know that Arabia was insufferable before the Prophet brought his message. We know that it improved immeasurably after his message. We know that hundreds of millions of people of the present world have improved their lives through Islam. So what does that tell us about the Prophet Muhammad? We know, on the contrary, that Basili is a convicted drug dealer, a convicted fraudster, and a confirmed liar. We know that he attempted to put the blame for the film onto the Jews. Just the trailer of this film has led to the deaths of people and all manner of upset around the world. So what does that tell us about Basili? Ironically, however, the Basili film is likely to inspire interest in the Prophet from more non-Muslims, people who really want to understand the Prophet and his life and message. So even in his malice, Basili inadvertently promotes the study of authentic Islam. Glory be to God. I call on the Muslims to calm down, to start being proactive, and to stop reacting with such violence. The Prophet is reported to have said, "The pen is mightier than the sword." So that's a statement from our dear friend Sheikh Satardian, which I just wanted to share. And
that was Wednesday.
This is issued yesterday, in fact, but I'm sharing it today.
For that.
It's a measured and intelligent response.
Very
and
intelligent response.
he's a very good man and an excellent scholar. So, okay, without further ado then, let's move on and ask Shaheen to take over and continue your second slot about, the Zoroastrian perspective. What I'm hoping you'll talk is specifically Zoroaster's teachings on peace, reconciliation, and what, because there is a military history of Zoroastrianism which we shouldn't overlook, and the Persian Empire, which was inspired by Zoroaster, did attack the ancient Greeks, and a lot of blood was spilt. So hopefully you can tell us about the thinking about war and peace in Zoroastrianism.
Right, in my earlier discussion, I was trying to explain what Zoroastrianism was, what were its main principles. But in terms of a social history, we believe that Zoroastrianism, as I said, was adopted by a king in Balkh, and thereafter it became the religion of the region, gradually replacing local variants of pagan animistic kind of religion, or living alongside them. There was Zoroastrianism, and alongside it there was also the earlier religion that was somehow incorporated. Over time, we don't know too much about the darker ages of Persian history, and we don't have the documentation, but we do have information starting with the advent of the Achaemenians, thanks to the Bible, the Old Testament, and also thanks to Herodotus, and some archaeological evidence found at Persepolis, which was the palace of the ancient Achaemenid kings. And if we start with Cyrus the Great, we believe that Cyrus was a Mazda worshipper, and that he left an inscription that is known as the first human rights charter, probably an exaggeration, but nevertheless an indication of his morality, where he talks about his conquest of Babylon and how he freed the Jews from the prisons that he found them in and helped them to rebuild their temple in Jerusalem, and how he allowed local peoples to carry on with their old ways of life and religion without him imposing his own brand of belief on them. So there's a first indication of perhaps tolerance and human respect for other ways and other cultures. that was then, because he began he freed the Iranians from the overlordship of the Medes, who were perhaps clan cousins, and then took over the Median Empire. It brought them into contact with the Greeks of Ionia, who were already living in Lydia under King Croesus. And when King Croesus sent to Delphi to find out what would happen if he took on the Persians, who were expanding westwards, he was told a mighty empire would be destroyed, and in his arrogance thought it would be the Iranians' mighty empire, not his own. He was wrong. And so the Iranians took over the Lydian Empire, and that brought them into close proximity with the Greeks. Thereafter, and by the way, between that arrival, that was Cyrus who did that, and Cyrus also extended the empire into Babylon and right down into what was Phoenicia, and was moving towards Sinai, and he died. So his son Cambyses took on the expansion, not to be any less than his father. He expanded into Egypt.
When on the timeline?
And we're talking about, Babylon was added around 535. Iran was liberated from the Medians in 549 and came to the Lydian coast, the Greeks on the Ionia in 545. And then Cambyses added Egypt in about 525. Or 529 in fact. And then when he died, Darius was left in charge. And it was Darius who, again, extended the empire and proclaimed himself as a Mazda worshipper. But in all the inscriptions that he's left, and there are quite a few inscriptions where Darius has left his thoughts, especially in Persepolis and on one or two other big ceremonial inscriptions, he asks for divine guidance from Ahura Mazda to be able to make his rule one of justice and fairness to all people. And he does proclaim that he respects other cultures. Now, in another extension, and it was he who then decided he would bring the expansion of the Iranian Empire into Europe, and he came into northern Greece in 512, and then his plan was to take over the rest of Greece, but was thwarted at the Battle of Marathon in 490, which is when the Iranians and the Greeks came into physical contact in Greece. Now, thereafter, the Greeks and the Iranians had a lot of interaction, and there are, as I mentioned earlier, Herodotus wrote a very favourable comment about some aspects of the Persians, considering that they were their enemy and they'd been fighting, and they fought even more fiercely at the Battle of Salamis 10 years after Marathon in 480, and the Persians were defeated and driven out of Greece. Considering all that background history, the Greeks did show admiration of the Persians, so there must have been something to admire. Aeschylus, for example, wrote a play called The Persians, in which he showed a great deal of sympathy with the plight of the Persians and the tragedy of motherhood, losing one's own children to war. So, but he put himself into the Persian shoes, which was, I think, showing a great deal of understanding and compassion and respect as well. And thereafter, we have writings by Xenophon, and he wrote a very eulogic, fictitious account of Cyrus's upbringing, called The Childhood of Cyrus. It's called the Thyropedia, in which he talks about the great virtues of child-rearing in ancient Iran, teaching children to tell the truth, to respect nature, to learn horticulture, the virtues of planting trees that the Iranians were famous for. And all this was being taught to the young Prince Cyrus in this fictitious account. Xenophon himself spent some time outside Greece when he was taking the fight into Persian territories. So the fact that there was expansion wars and wars where the Greeks went into Persian territories and the Persians came into Greek territories was nothing new. Similarly, the Medians had conquered the Persians and then the Persians got themselves freed. So it's not as if it was a one-sided activity. It was much, I think, probably the custom of the times, and indeed still, unfortunately, the custom of the times that we live in here. Territorial expansion for the gain of prestige and resources. But moving on, the Iranians then eventually were, and I should say that at that time, we know that probably Pythagoras was a great admirer of Persian philosophy, and once and we mentioned the Persian, the peace that was made with Persia. This came about around 449, when finally the Athenians and the Persians came to a deal where they defined territorial waters, who could not go west of this line and who could not go east of this line, so they could live in peace from about 449 onwards BC. And this peace seems to have more or less worked for some time. until, and as a result of that, the Ionians who were living in the Asia Minor on the coastline, but were in constant contact with traders and cultural exchanges from the east, were very aware of what was going on in the heartland of Persia, the philosophy, the science, and Persia in turn was bringing information in from India. I should have told you that Darius was famous for using and trying to create an empire that was best for his people. He took the calendar system from India, the solar calendar system. He took the justice system from Babylon. He took the financial and currency system from Lydia. He was trying to create a world in which everybody would benefit from the various civilizations and developments that were available within the. So it was a kind of an attempt to create a global culture out of the different corners of the empire. And I then will move forward to the end of the period of classical Greece, when eventually Alexander appeared and decided that he would extend his father's successful empire building from Macedon, which had taken over all of classical Greece in a very short space of time, and he would take on the challenge of going into Asia, which he did. But he did actually also have a lot of respect for the Iranians. He wanted to try and create a new empire in which the great qualities of the Iranians would marry up with the great qualities of the Macedonians and the Greeks. And he married a Persian princess, and he married as he went along to try and create a new hybrid society of the best of the Persians and the best of the Greeks. And he encouraged his soldiers and officers to do so as well. So he was trying to create a kind of eugenic society, like the best of what both sides had to offer. This, of course, did not happen very successfully because he died at a very young age before he could see his particular plan fulfilled, and it was obviously being perhaps planned by some degree of force. It was not to succeed. But what he left behind were his generals, who each of them did take up the idea of localism, and they became local tribesmen, tribal chieftains, or local chieftains, local princes in their own right. So the Persian Empire that had been collapsed became a very short-lived Macedonian one, went on to become localized through the Macedonian generals, and that was then defeated by another indigenous Persian uprising led by the Parthians from northeast Iran. And the Parthians brought back Zoroastrianism, it seems. We have very little that is a definitive writing from that period. Our sources of information are very few and far between, because whatever we are told, whatever we had, and you mentioned this yourself, Thomas, Alexander's army set fire to and destroyed on their way. Some say it was a mistake and that Alexander very much admired the Persian Empire and did not want to burn the Persian capital down, Persepolis. It was a mistake, a drunken moment. I think the film Alexander portrays it like that. But anyway, the fact is that that's why we don't have many writings from a contemporary period, so we don't know, and we're dependent on the odds and ends of sources of fragments of information. But anyway, the Parthians, we believe, were Zoroastrians, with again a localized element to it, bringing in other local deities. And then in turn, after 200 or 300 years of Parthian rule, the Sasanians, who came from the same province, Pars, that the Achaemenids came from, and who were a dynasty who had a priestly background, emerged, took on in individual combat the last king of the Parthians and fought it out. And because Ardashir, the Sasanian, won, he was then the guy who became a legitimate king. And because he came from a line of priests, it is believed that the Sasanians were particularly interested in reviving and imposing Zoroastrianism as a state religion. Now, we're talking about around 200 AD. That is about 1,500 years, if not 1,700 or more, from the time that Zoroaster appeared and had his first revelation, his vision of how life should be. So whatever we find from that period, and indeed in this new period of Sasanian Zoroastrianism, there was a revival. And they did, the high priest Tansar did order, and then later on Kartir ordered the redaction of surviving texts. They got all the texts to be brought in, all the priests were ordered to bring in what they had to try and make a new best version of what had survived. But of course this was an, if you like, an interference. This was a redaction. This was now 1,500 years after the original teaching. It's like getting a King James Bible, but King James inventing what the contents would be for that Bible and saying this is now the authoritative new version. So by this time, many of the basic ideas had got distorted, distracted, and were no longer faithful to Zoroastrianism in its real sense. Example, many people have heard that Zoroastrianism is about good and evil, and indeed I think I mentioned it very clearly that it was to be our mission in life, our target, to be able to distinguish and hear the inner voice that takes you away from the path of negative actions towards positive actions. We had the beneficent spirit, serpentameniu, and the negative spirit, angrameniu. Now by this time, if you think of how Chaucer's language from 1,000 years ago is so different to today's language, imagine what the language would have changed, how it would have changed with 1,500 years. So the words angrameniu had become known as ahriman. The concept of Ahura Mazda, the enlightened thinking mind that is wise and inspires thinking, was changed to Ormezd. So we had Ahriman becoming Ahriman, Ahura Mazda becoming Ormezd, and people had lost the concept of serpentameniu on the way, so that it seemed like God was being counterposed with the devil, if you like, Ahriman, the negative thinking. And that is how many people misunderstood and misinterpreted Zoroastrianism. They had stopped looking at the ancient version, they were looking at the much newer version and misrepresenting it. So that gave rise to a lot of misunderstanding and misrepresentation. I haven't talked about the role of fire in Zoroastrianism, which represents the life energy, that represents the spirit, that represents purity, that represents total purity and cleanliness and truth. It is a symbol for all those things, enlightenment. And so fire plays a very important role in as far as it represents all those concepts. It represents life, and it provides life to humans, both through its warmth and through its ability to cook and give us food. So fire has a very central role, and we always respect fire. We look to the sun, we look to the light. Light plays a very important part in our day-to-day thanksgiving, and our prayers and our religious functions about thanksgiving, thanks to the creation that we perceive around us, the beauty of nature, the regularity of the seasons coming back. All the festivals that we celebrate, I mentioned, are to do with thanksgiving and joy, that we can eat, drink and be merry and dance and sing and revel in each other's company, men and women, and be inspired by the muse through alcohol, which in its small doses is good, and to be lauded and to be upheld as a positive agent for merriment and joy, as well as medicinal as well. So this is the idea behind Zoroastrianism. We find that once the Arabs conquered Persia in the 7th century, around 630s onwards, Zoroastrianism was certainly marginalized. I have to say, and it is well accepted, that the Zoroastrians priests, by the time of the Arabs, had made Zoroastrianism such an elaborate state religion, rather like we could say Catholicism, which has its high church and all the required rituals and all the hierarchy of priests and ministers and bishops and so on. Undoubtedly, although we don't have great records of this, we have indications of a hierarchy and very heavy requirements put on the laity. So I think it would be not unreasonable to suggest that many people welcomed a freeing up of all those onerous obligations when they were offered something else. But many people were clearly threatened and frightened by the arrival of conquerors who imposed their ways upon them, and they joined the winning side for survival purposes. Those who did not join the winning side were very much the downtrodden, the poor, the ones who fled, the ones who didn't have ambitions, who were not looking after their careers and who were not worried about their property, because clearly all those things went by the wayside if you don't join the winning side. And the history of Zoroastrians thereafter was one where they were regularly persecuted, regularly pressurized to change their religion, and very regularly the texts were demanded by different zealous kings and powerful priests, and they were put in piles and set fire to, so that the Zoroastrians had very few extant texts, which is why they, and also judging from the Alexander experience, they learnt to memorize all their knowledge and texts. Although we have got some texts that were written from the later period. They are few and far between, but we do have some. But as I said, these are late texts and they reflect many values of Zoroastrianism, but not necessarily, if you like, the pure original form. So the story goes on to a point where We hear that Zoroastrians carried on being faithful to their original teachings of respecting the countryside, the ecology, understanding the environment, learning to work with nature. They became famous for their gardening and horticultural skills, their arboricultural skills, which goes right back to the ancient days that were already mentioned in the Cyropedia, where Xenophon mentions these skills. And when the Safavids in the 16th century made a new capital in Isfahan, and when the Qajar kings of the 19th century made a new capital in Tehran, they asked for Zoroastrian. They demanded that Zoroastrian should be brought to create the gardens for the palaces. We also hear that in Isfahan, once they were used for that purpose, and there's a comment by one of these European travellers about how their quarters were so much wider and tree planted and beautiful, then they were pogromed and they were wiped out by a later zealous king who chose to do that. Similarly, the Qajar kings used Zoroastrian gardeners, and that was the start of the new capital, Tehran. In the 19th century, the Zoroastrians were probably at their lowest nadir because constantly, and I didn't mention this, they were expected to pay an infidel tax for not conforming to Islam. And there were all sorts of other pressures put on them to convert. For example, if one sibling converted to Islam, they took the whole inheritance over all the other siblings. And the only other way for you to keep your inheritance was also to convert so that you kept your inheritance share. There were all sorts of rulings. You couldn't build a house above ground, you could only build below ground. You couldn't walk barefoot on the ground because you'd sully the ground on which other people would walk. You weren't allowed to ride a donkey because that was an insult to those who were not on donkey. And there were many other, they weren't allowed to wear glasses. There were so many prohibitions that were petty-minded and just designed to harass their lives that of course more and more people just converted to get out of these obligations. And eventually our numbers were down to about 7,500 right at the end of the 19th century. I didn't mention that in the 10th century life was so hard, in fact, and so oppressive that a bunch of people got into a boat. They came down from the north of Iran, they travelled through Iran, they got onto a boat in the Persian Gulf and they sailed and arrived in India eventually. These people were then known as Parsis. They got permission from their local ruler in India, a Hindu, to live there in peace and harmony with other people. And they were given certain conditions. You must not have public ceremonies in the daytime, you must conform and wear clothes like ourselves, and so on, so that they wanted them to live so that they could coexist without being overtly different and overtly in their face. And they very happily welcomed these conditions because they were a darn sight better than the conditions they had to try and put up with in Iran. So they came to India, and in due course they thrived. From a handful, they eventually became at their peak 150,000 Parsis. And the Parsi community is remarkable. They did really well in India. They produced outstanding individuals who were very philanthropic, because that is one of the basic principles of Zoroastrianism. You work hard, you make land work for you, you produce, you enjoy the benefit of your own hard work. So money is not a bad thing, wealth is not a bad thing, land is not a bad thing, but you must share. You must let others benefit from the proceeds of your good fortune. And we have instituted in our calendar 6 times a year, where for 5 days we have ceremonial feasting in memory of the dead, and that is from charitable endowments and bequests that people give, so that they will be remembered in their death, but allow people who are alive to benefit from the opportunity to come together and eat together. And so Parsis in India carried on this concept, but began, because they became fabulously wealthy, they began to found orphanages, hospitals, schools, and amongst the very first charitable organisations in India were these endowments by Parsis. And alongside that, interestingly, and they were highly educated, they became more and more educated as time went on, to the point where actually some came to Britain, and the first 3 MPs to be voted into the Westminster Parliament in Britain, who were not white English people, were 3 Parsis who were of the Zoroastrian faith, who came from an Indian background, Parsi background. But they were not the millions of Hindus or the thousands of Sikhs, billions, millions probably also, of Muslims and Sikhs and Hindus of India. They were amongst the only 150,000 Zoroastrians of India, and that in itself should be wondered at, and one has to ask oneself, what qualities did they have? And it's that philanthropy, it's that desire to try and better mankind. They were living so true to their principles. That's what people saw through them and were able to entrust to them. So that's an interesting thing. Then we have other famous people. Freddie Mercury was a Parsi Zoroastrian. Zubin Mehta, the conductor of the Israeli Philharmonic Orchestra, is a Zoroastrian. The famous Tatar group that own many of the industries now in Britain, Zoroastrian. So the Zoroastrians have got to where they have, despite there being tiny, tiny population, and in Iran also, under the regime that allowed the opportunity to flourish, we did well. Now let me just go back to what happened to the 7,500 Iranians, because the news got back to India, to these rather better off Parsis, that the Zoroastrians of Iran were almost wiped out. And they rallied very quickly, and they petitioned the British government, and they managed to agree that to put pressure on the Iranian regime of the time, so that the infidel tax was no longer to be levied. The Parsis paid off a lump sum to pay that off, so that they were no longer harassed. And soon after that, they began to lift many of these restrictions. By 1925, there was a regime change, and the Shah that was crowned, that took over, first of all, it was a one-year republic because he refused to be crowned, but he accepted. Reza Shah, the last Shah's father, introduced many, many reforms into Iranian society, including his attempt to free the rights of minority religions. And so for the first time after from about 1906 onwards, the regime previous to this one was gradually being forced to adapt itself, and there was a first Zoroastrian parliamentary representative alongside other minority religions, and gradually restrictions became less and less severe. By 1925, Zoroastrians were now, under the new regime, allowed to go to university, go into parliament, go into proper jobs. They were allowed, eventually we even had one man become a deputy prime minister under the previous regime, and head of university. But all that was unfortunately short-lived. I have to say that that chap, Reza Shah, who came in, did a lot of things to bring back Iranian national identity and Iranian consciousness. He, for example, removed the Arabic names of the months and reinstated ancient Iranian month names that were from the Zoroastrian calendar. And he introduced a great national consciousness of how Iran existed before Islam, and gave it a sense of its own identity, rooting right back to the pre-Islamic past. And the previous Shah also went on with that. And much of the ancient Iranian festival seasons were now reintroduced in Iran. When the regime changed and the Islamic Revolution came in, one of the things that they tried to do was abolish the Persian New Year. But there was so much public resistance to that that they did not succeed. But they have been thought to be, the Islamic Revolution has thought to foster much more Arabic identity, Islamic identity through Arabic. And that has been resisted by Iranians. And so there is this tension between what the government is trying to do and what the people actually want as a national identity. So that has been interesting, and many people in Iran choose now to identify with a regime, not a regime, but with a government and a moral order that predates the arrival of Islam in Iran. And they do this in different ways. They wear particular icons to show that they have an identity. They wear things around their neck to show that. They wear T-shirts. And of course it is very difficult because they are courting trouble if they do that anyway. So the interesting thing is that while this regime has brought about a revival of Islam in Iran on the official front, it also created a backlash of people who have not appreciated the way things have gone and want to identify and signal that they have little sympathy with what is being done in the name of the government, in the name of their country. Now, in terms of peace and tolerance, because the Iranians have had a history of contact with other people from different civilizations and cultures, they have a history of tolerance and understanding and interconnectedness. It is true that through different periods there have been different kings with different agendas, and some have been less true to their Zoroastrian ideals than others. But that is perhaps the nature of humanity, that some are better at being good than others. Some forget that they're being empowered by a presence of luck, holy divine luck, divine spirit, to take them forward. Some refer to it and ask for guidance. Some in their arrogance forget that they owe their position to something beyond themselves. And so at the moment, I believe that Iran is going through an unfortunate period where human rights are not respected. There is intolerance towards anybody who wants to be different and doesn't conform. And that this is not spoken about publicly. It cannot be spoken about publicly because anybody who raises their voice is likely to be shot down, have a death threat against them. It is a dangerous thing to be bold and to be courageous and to say what the truth is. The nature of the regime is that they want to suppress knowledge. They want to suppress the history of Iran. They don't want people to talk about how things were in the past. History books have been rewritten, and it is the hope, I believe, that a generation will grow up not knowing that once upon a time, not very long ago, Iran knew a lot more freedom than it's seeing today. We pray, I didn't talk about prayer and stuff like that, but there are Zoroastrians who feel inclined to be religious and pray, and many do, pray and renew their initiation vows, because when we are young, we have a ceremony of initiation, and they will pray in front of a source of light. Yeah, and it's often a little fire that you have in a container, or a light, or a candle, or something. Yeah. But it's, you know, it's the act of the pious, and if you're moved to be pious, you will do that.
The Vedic love of Agni, the god of fire, is similar to the Zoroastrian.
Yes. Well, it's the respect of fire. We don't worship fire, and it must be said very clearly. We don't worship fire. Fire is there in a symbolic way, as a cross is in the church, a reminder of something that you think about. The fire is there to focus your attention on creativity, purity, beauty, anything. It's a contemplative and meditational symbol. So we don't worship fire, but it is an important
you worship
element.
with fire or through fire.
Yes, through fire. And our worship is not so much a worship to God, please help me because I'm in trouble, please intervene and stop this or this from happening, or it's much more praise giving. It's much more, you know, may my mind be clear, may my work be good, praise be for the beauty of the season, praise be for, may praise be for the rain that comes.
And are there regular prayer times in
well, we have tradition, and I don't know where this came from, but we believe it's very, very ancient, 5 different parts of the day. The day is divided into 5 different periods, and I suspect it's to do with helping people to identify time. Now, as an anthropologist, I know that when you go to certain parts of the world and you ask them what time you should do this or this, they say when the sun is at this part of the mountain, when the sun is at this part of the mountain. It's a way of delineating time. And so I think the 5 parts of prayer time were about actually dividing the ancient days into time periods, and they were marked by prayer times. And that is how it carried on. And some people say, and I think it's not unaccepted by scholars, that the 5 prayer times in Islam were probably picked up from the 5 prayer times of Zoroastrianism, but it's a speculation. As indeed we say that the concept of, we did not dwell heavily on heaven and hell, but we do dwell very heavily on good deeds and bad deeds. And we do have the concept that when you die, your life energy is released. It is, if you like, the soul. And the soul starts its journey, the energy of life starts its journey to be reunited with the cosmic whole. And we believe that at the point of death, on the 3rd day, you pass over a bridge where your good deeds and your bad deeds are weighed up. And if you're going to make it across to the abode of everlasting light, as it is sometimes called, or the abode of everlasting song, the house of song, that is the only way we can describe heaven and what happens after life. It's the house of song and the house of light. You will either go on that journey, you will only get there if your good deeds outweigh your bad deeds. And that is, if you like, a carrot to keep you doing good things in this life. But there is, the other side of it is that if you don't make it across, then you either spend all your time never getting there, or if you're positively bad, we don't really know what happens. If there's really no good deeds at all, then you're never going to make it on that journey at all. Now, later on, that was elaborated into some rather dreadful place. But in the early period, we have nothing to give us information about what happens if you don't make it across the bridge. But the concepts, it is said, of this heaven and this hell, this best place, this best, because the word for heaven is vaheshta, which Behesht in modern Persian comes from vaheshta, which means the best righteousness, the best virtue. It's from the word asha, it's a superlative, vaheshta. And so the idea is the best place is for the goodies, but the worst place, presumably, therefore, must be for the baddies. But we don't know what that worst place is. Now, that is then what perhaps informed the idea of heaven and hell through Judaism, and then it came into Christianity. So that is suggested that is very much the inspiration for the heaven and hell concepts that we have.
Do you have a concept of the afterlife? Or?
No, the afterlife does not exist. We simply move from this corporal body into a spiritual journey, or a soul journey, where the cosmic takes over. And we don't come back. We're not revisited. We have to do what we have to do in this life. We have only one chance. We have to make a good life for ourselves and those around us. And it is our responsibility to make those choices, conscious that that is it. We have no fear of death. Death is not a bad thing. It is a natural thing. We are not supposed to wail and lament when people die. We wear white. We don't wear black. We see black as the colour of death, mourning, negativity, and we always wear white in our religious ceremonies. Everything is white. Joy. Yeah, and we wear green and red. I mean, all traditionally people wore green and red for marriages and things. Happiness.
So what do you do with illnesses?
What do we do with illnesses? Well, illnesses are one of the things that plague us as part of the natural world, and we have to try and keep a clean environment. Cleanliness is very much a part of keeping illness away. I mean, it became, actually we know that today because we've heard about microbes. But in the ancient past, they didn't know about microbes, but it was something that naturally they observed, I suppose, they realised. And dead bodies are not left anywhere near living people. We don't dig holes and put them into the earth, because some people die of epidemics and illnesses, so we don't put them in cemeteries around communities of settlements. We take them up to far high mountains away from the community, and we expose them on high mountain tops, so they're away from the community, and they're contained inside high walls. And then in the desert, vultures would come and eat the bodies clean, and then the sun would bleach the bones, and then one person would be designated to go and collect the bones up, put them in a well, and pour concentrated urine on them that would frizzle them up and dispose of them.
You mentioned earlier the rather unenlightened culture towards disabled people.
Oh, yes.
Now, is that not your own tradition, but more the modern tradition? And
I think we don't know. I mean, the answer is I cannot tell you that I know that there's textual evidence that in the past, in the ancient past, people who were disabled were well cared for. But I can tell you that there is, in certain countries that you might observe that have some things in common, and it could be called the third world, where there has not been much development in terms of humane understanding of people's needs. In countries where women perhaps are not treated as decently as they should be treated, they have certain things in common, and one of them is the bad treatment of women, and then the proliferation of poverty and dirtiness. Those things seem to have cultural commonalities, and in those countries it is also to be said that disabled people are not nicely treated, or have not been, and then of course there is growing enlightenment as they come into contact with different standards that are perhaps exported now from the West back to those countries. And, you know, they are learning and realising the error of their ways, but it's certainly true that in the past it left a lot to be desired.
And you were talking...
The recent past that I'm talking about, I mean, I'm talking about from my own experiential past, or my parents' experiential past. I cannot talk about what was happening in the 7th century AD, you know.
You were mentioning America earlier. Surely they do have a very strategic, they've got strategic interests in the area, and particularly because of the oil-producing areas, you mentioned those as well. So, I mean, that is also there to...
Well, Iran was an oil-producing country before. It hasn't suddenly stopped, it hasn't suddenly become one. In fact, its oil production has gone backwards. Iran was producing oil in the 1960s, back from actually from the British began to exploit oil in Iran from about the 1900s. Iran's oil production has gone up and up and up. Everybody is pragmatic. Everybody knows that we have something to gain from somebody else. The Iranians wanted to get something out of somebody, and they were in turn paying for it with oil. You know, it was a currency. They had something to offer. Things haven't changed in that respect. If one country wants oil and the other country has it, they can do a nice trading exchange. It works. You know, we are able to do that with all the Gulf states. You know, we have other countries that produce oil where it doesn't have to lead to war and enmity. It seems to me that the stakes are raised by the rhetoric that is being produced out of Iran by the government. And they are talking about the annihilation of Israel. Well, what kind of friendly talk is that? How could you not want to criticise a country that is talking actively and positively, trying to raise the antagonism of its own people on a false premise? What? Why? Why should they want to destroy Israel? What business is it of theirs to start talking about the defence of the Palestinian people? Why should they be jumping into that action? It's total interference and exporting of a very aggressive foreign policy by Iran, and not surprisingly, some people don't like it. I don't like it personally. I think it's outrageous. So for Iran to start taking any moral position about the United States is a terrific hypocrisy, which they don't, of course, flag up themselves. So I would just say that the American rhetoric is not against Iran because of its oil. If they could have a reasonable relationship,
geographical position,
yes, but
as a gateway
yes,
to the,
but they've had a relationship with many other oil-producing countries that is not a hostile or aggressive one, and they did before. I suspect, and I would suggest, if you read an aggressive American attitude towards Iran, it is because it's a response to the aggressive Iranian, and I think much more aggressive Iranian rhetoric against America. I don't hear Obama saying Iran must be wiped out. I don't hear Obama or British Prime Minister or Western Prime Minister saying that despite the many covert assassinations of people that has been sponsored by Iran, that they should make all-out war on Iran. But Iran is saying death to America. They get people, they pay thugs they bring coachloads of people into the capital to demonstrate in front of the American embassy or the British embassy and burn the American flag. When do you see the Americans ever burning an Iranian flag? You don't. They are stoking the fire in Iran.
Can I just butt in there? I mean, there was, of course, the famous or infamous Quran burning that.
Well, that is that.
There was that
was not
anti-Iranian; it was anti-Islamic.
Yeah, that was that madman.
I mean,
priest.
Just to come at this from a slightly different angle, what makes this all very dangerous, of course, is when nuclear weapons get on the table, and that's really when Israel starts getting very twitchy. And can you just comment on any views you've got on whether you think Iran is trying to develop nuclear weapons or not? And also, I'd like your views as a senior Zoroastrian elder. What's the Zoroastrian view on nuclear weapons?
Yes. There were no nuclear weapons when Zoroaster was preaching his mission. So he doesn't get. Let me put it like this. First of all, I need to make it clear, I'm talking as myself, I'm not talking in the name of the World Zoroastrian Organization.
No, obviously.
That is, my views are my views. I cannot stand up and here say, this is the official line. So please take that as a basic reading of it. The question of nuclear weapons. Because I have come to see that whatever the Iranian government says is actually untrue mostly, well, not whatever, but much of what they've said has been untrue in the past. They talk about defending the rights of human beings. No, they don't. They respect human rights. No, they don't. They respect the position of women. No, they don't. There is so much that is just not true and they put over as rhetoric that I have a very low confidence in anything that they put out as an official statement. So when the Iranians say that they are open to inspections and then they procrastinate and don't let the inspectors from the Nuclear Energy Commission come in, one wonders why. They procrastinate, and then they find out that they've moved all their nuclear installations underground and they've done all sorts of shenanigans in between times because they're being clever. They're playing for time and they're messing about. So I don't have an iota of confidence or trust in anything that they tell us officially. And I think what they say is one thing, what they're doing is another thing. And we talked about this in the past, that there's certain concepts in Islam where you can, if you like, pretend or put out some sort of false image and underneath be doing something else. And that's an accepted Islamic practice, tahiyya, where you can put out an official line, but underneath it be doing something else. And if that's accepted in some aspects of Islamic practice, then it seems to me that it's quite possible it's going to be accepted and practiced in another as well. Pardon me?
Speaking with a forked tongue.
Yes, speaking with a forked tongue. I think that the moral concepts may be different. What is truth to us may not be understood as truth to them. I mean, I just don't know how they can justify these very, very opposed and ambivalent ways of behaving. However, anything is possible. I simply don't know what to believe because there's been so much hypocrisy in what they've done in the past. And what does Zoroastrian say about war in general, nuclear power in general? I think that any right-minded, right-thinking person, Zoroastrian or not, can understand that it is not nice to have war. We see what's the result of war. We see that people die, families suffer, everybody is bereaved, there is hardship, shortage of food, beautiful things are blown up, there is insecurity. There is most terrible consequences of war. Who could say that war is a good thing? Nobody. Nobody in their right minds. But if you're defending yourself, you're defending your right to exist in freedom, in toleration, in respect of each other. If a pluralistic society is threatened by the intolerance of one other society, then there is a space to defend yourself and your way of life. And that is a very difficult moral decision to make, because none of us want to go into that situation. I don't want to end up fighting, and I'm not sure I would have the moral courage to fight for what I believe in. But that may be forced on me at some point or other. And sadly, when you're weak and vulnerable, it is very difficult to fight back, even if you know that a terrible injustice is being perpetrated. And I think a lot of people live in fear now, and they don't stand up for what they believe in, because it's even more scary that you might get threatened and beaten back and hit. So it is a very difficult position that we find ourselves in. I think a lot of people are extremely threatened and frightened, don't really know how to behave and how to deal with it, because it's so aggressive.
Well, yes. I mean, this is, I think, where philosophy comes in, which means the love of wisdom. I mean, you said earlier that your supreme deity, Ahura Mazda, means the great wisdom, the supreme wisdom. As a philosopher, I would say that our supreme deity is the same. And all religions should share this. My vision is that if we could sublimate the energy that goes into fear and hatred and eventually violence into love, if we can somehow find a magic transmutation of the fear into love, and the love of that common source, the true wisdom that is behind the universe, the divine intelligence, whatever you want to call it, then wouldn't we be fulfilling all our scriptures?
I think you would, but the question remains, why do some people not heed that message? I mean, as I said from the very beginning, the Zoroastrian philosophy of doing good, of trying to serve humanity, of trying to increase the stockpile of goodness, the good vibes that are going around the earth, is the basic mission of us as human beings, because we don't have two chances. Why make a mess of the first chance? We've got to make it work for ourselves, to create harmony through kindness. It's basically kindness and service that's going to get us to increase our good life on earth. And where those people have lost that path, they're not thinking along those lines. And I don't know what lines they're thinking of, but I don't think they're thinking at all.
Well, they've come a little lost. And
they have certainly gone off the right path. They've lost the path of Ashar. And the worry is that because they are in power, they hold the keys, they have the power to control and terrorize. And intolerance and the belief that only their way is the right way, that they must impose their way on others, is the biggest fear that they can
I mean, the
wield.
Muslims I've met, the scholars I've met, and I must be blessed, I've met some supremely intelligent, gifted academic scholars of Islam. You know, what I've observed, and I've observed it in other faiths, not just Islam, but the more intelligent they are, the more humble they are,
yes.
and the more tolerant. As Newton said, the more I discover, the less I know.
Yes.
You know, when you truly know something in depth, you know how many more questions there are.
Of course.
And it's as Francis Bacon said, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. It's a great deal of knowledge is the only antidote. Yeah. We're dealing with people of little knowledge,
yes.
and they just, bless them, need a bit more knowledge.
Well, let's
hope it's very difficult to synthesise that with global capitalism, where greed is good. You know, it's to want the betterment of mankind rather than a stockpile not of good deeds but of
material goods.
Well, I understand, of course, that we don't want to be greedy, but I think that capitalism is a very natural evolution for humankind. I think that has not come because somebody said, let's put out a new philosophy and get everyone to buy into it. I think it emerged as a natural process of the evolution of human beings, where because we have managed to provide enough food for ourselves, we're no longer thinking about what can we eat tomorrow, we're thinking of how else can I make my life more pleasant? And they think that maybe more material goods, a nicer house, a bigger space. Space isn't a luxury, people want more space, and they keep on aspiring. But I do think, and this was a question I was asked to take part in a programme, one of those little tiny video shorts, is it all right to ask God to make me rich? And the question is, and I said earlier, that having wealth is not a bad thing. Having wealth can be used for good. is not to be greedy, not to be selfish when you're wealthy. So the work ethic is very strongly embedded in the Zoroastrian community, that we work hard so that we can produce more, but we should share the benefit, not stockpile it just for ourselves. Okay, have as much as you think you need, but always allow that extra bit for others. That's the important thing.
So kind of social capitalism.
Yes.
Other people and the planet.
Yes.
Makes
Yes. And just the general condemnation of capitalism and wealth, I think, is a very unrealistic way to go about thinking. You know, let us be real. You know, we all have aspirations for ourselves. I mean, what human being doesn't want to slightly improve their own quality of life, the quality for their children, the aspirations for their family? It's a natural instinct. But what we also have to do is to remember that it's but for the grace of God that we have that good fortune, and that we must always think of people who, if we don't look after them, actually, will create problems. Now, we have to think about making a society harmonious so that we can all enjoy a community that is harmonious. We don't have riots in England all the time. We had them last summer. Who knows what caused those? But we have to think about that. What are we doing for the others? You know, that's why we have socialism.
Can I just raise, before we move on to our next slot, bring it back to Britain, because you live in Britain, you live in Oxford, and you've worked in education in Britain. Mm-hmm. I know that as a religious studies teacher, let alone the children of Iran not getting objective, religious studies information, I feel that British children would benefit from learning more about, say, Zoroastrianism as part of the curriculum of religious education they get in schools. I know that as a child I was fascinated by it, and always have been. And when I read my ancient history A-level and discovered, how interesting it all was, and the history of the Greek, Persian, cultural interactions and so on, I think that wouldn't it be a good thing if Zoroastrianism was included among the other religions in the national curriculum? And has there been any attempts by Zoroastrian scholars to get it in there?
I can answer that from my experience of sitting on the Oxfordshire Sacre, which is the Standing Advisory Committee for Religious Education, because each county in England has its own body that advises. Yeah. But there's a national stipulation that the religious education curriculum must include Christianity plus 2 other religions amongst the 6 acknowledged religions within Britain that are prevalent, and they include Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Sikhism, Hinduism, and Christianity. They're the 6 religions. And so any other religions that exist, such as Zoroastrianism, we're a very, very small number. Remember, the world population is only 150,000 maximum. So no wonder that our representation in Britain is marginal. We are perhaps 5,000 to 6,000 Zoroastrians in England, Britain, mainly Parsis, maybe if we're lucky about 800 Iranian origin people, maybe 1,000, but 5,000 Parsis. How is that voice going to be heard? How can we get our voice across? The religious education curriculum does not prevent other religions from being taught, but those have to be taught. It has to be Christianity and 2 other major religions of that set named. Sure. And then if somebody somewhere has heard of Zoroastrianism and can persuade their head of department they want to teach that, they can find a slot. But religious education is very squeezed in Britain. Yeah. It is the poor cousin. It's being squeezed and squeezed and squeezed out. And
well, that's something I've always fought against. I think we should have more of it. And, less emphasis on ICT and mathematics, as if that's the only kind of knowledge that matters.
There is certainly...
I'd certainly be interested to work with you and other Zoroastrians to make sure that voice is heard.
Well, I would be delighted to see that other people might want to make it available.
There was a horrific incident of a religious studies teacher being beaten up in East London recently.
I didn't hear about that.
No. Okay, he was teaching in a school in East London, in Tower Hamlets, where I used to work with the Gandhi Foundation, and some Muslims in the school. It was a large area with Muslim children, a state school, decided they didn't want him teaching their children because he was teaching objective, academic.
Yeah. Was he a non-Muslim himself?
Yeah. I presume so. And he was actually beaten up viciously to the point of trauma and fractures,
horrible.
all kinds of things. So it's a bit of a frontline issue.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to end with that, saying that as an institute we're dedicated to education as the solution to these problems.